Thanks, Andrew. So I'm delighted to be here. So I'll begin by telling you a bit of background about what this was all about. So a little over 2 years ago, I was sitting in my office at the University of Chicago Law School, working on a book about sex, and the phone rang, and it was one of my former students, Lisa Monaco, who was then a national security advisor to the Department of Justice, and she said to me, the president would like to appoint a 5-person review group to examine the government's foreign intelligence surveillance programs in light of Edward Snowden's disclosures, to advise both him and the Congress about whether any of those programs should be reconsidered or redefined or reformed, and he asked if you'd be willing to serve. And my initial reaction to that was, oh shit. I was deeply trying to finish this book. I am skeptical about whether presidential or governmental commissions reports ever have any real impact. And I just didn't see how this was going to be any different. But you don't say no casually to the president. You don't say no to a former student. You don't say no to the president when you hired him when you were dean of the law school. So there's a relationship there. And so I said, of course, happy to do it. And I figured, however, that this wasn't really going to happen. Because one of the things Lisa told me was that I would need a top secret clearance. And there's enough stuff in my background that I figured this will never happen. And the next day, a person from the government came to interrogate me about my past. And I gleefully told her all sorts of things that I was sure would disqualify me. And to my dismay, she was not impressed with any of them. And the next thing I knew, I was on a plane a couple of days later heading to Washington for a meeting in the Situation Room with the President and the Director of National Security, Susan Rice, and the Attorney General, Eric Holder, and several other similar types. And I remember thinking on the plane that what was I going to contribute to this, and how should one think about this question that I've been asked now to think about? And I had 3 perspectives that occurred to me on that flight to DC that day. One of them was that it must be very daunting to have the responsibility of keeping the nation safe against terrorism in a world in which the threat was quite real, the magnitude was potentially quite great, as we saw on 9/11, but one could easily imagine far worse in the realm of biological weapons, chemical weapons, nuclear weapons, and the like, and in which the enemy was not deterrable. And the deterrable thing is one that actually caught my focus for a bit. Because in the law and in international relations, the principal factor we rely upon to keep ourselves safe from bad people is deterrence. That is, we basically say, if you do something to us, we will hunt you down and we will punish you. Or in international relations, if you attack us, we will destroy you. But the challenge posed by terrorism after 9/11 was that deterrence is completely non-existent. The individuals who are launching the attacks themselves, as we saw on 9/11, are perfectly willing to die, so you can't very well threaten to kill them or put them in jail. And it's not a nation state who's your enemy, so there's no one against whom you can retaliate. There's no one you can say, you do this to us, we're going to make you pay. because there's no one morally you can make pay. And so there's this sense of nakedness in terms of the most important factor that individuals, the state, nations rely upon to keep people from doing bad things. There's no deterrence. And so that was kind of sobering. And I thought further that, along the same lines, that in a world of no deterrence, the only thing you can do to keep yourself safe is to prevent attacks from occurring by learning about them before they occur and doing something to stop them. And that's a very huge challenge in a situation in which you have a world of many billions of people scattered over the globe who can communicate with one another at great distances and instantly, and plan and plot these attacks in ways that are not at all visible or easy to discern. And this made me think of a quote I had read, and actually used it in the book I wrote, from James Baker, who was Chief of Staff to President Bush after 9/11. And Baker had said that being in the White House in the months and years after 9/11, with the responsibility of keeping the nation safe, was a bit like being the goalie in a soccer game, where if the opponent scores a goal, 3,000 people die, where all of the other players are invisible, and where the ball is invisible, and where you have to stop the ball from going in the net. And the only way you can do that is by watching the blades of grass and trying to figure out whatever it is you can figure out from the way the blades of grass are moving. And that's a very sobering thought about what it actually feels like being responsible for preventing that ball from going in the net. So one thing I thought about on the way to DC that day was this is no easy task to keep the nation safe from this type of enemy in the contemporary world. The second thing I thought about was, why me? Right? What do I have to offer here? And I've spent most of my career as a civil libertarian. I'm on the National Advisory Council of the ACLU, and I was chair of the board of the American Constitution Society. And so obviously I was being brought there in part because I bring that perspective to bear on these questions, which I thought was a good thing, that they wanted that perspective to be presented. And I could add that value into the mix. And the third thing I thought about along these lines was that a lot of the writing I have done in the years preceding that phone call were about the problem of the exercise of authority in times of crisis in American history, and focusing on the fact that repeatedly in our history, when faced with a crisis mentality, we had, human nature being what it is, quite naturally erred on the side of doing our best to ensure our safety, but invariably in ways that, when judged by hindsight, could be seen to have gone too far. And this goes back to the Alien and Sedition Acts, it goes back to the suspensions of the writ of habeas corpus by Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, to the extreme suppression of dissent during the First World War, to the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, to the McCarthy era, and to the actions during the Vietnam War era by J. Edgar Hoover, Richard Nixon, and Lyndon Johnson in terms of creating massive surveillance programs in abusive manners against political enemies. And so the other thing I thought I could bring to bear on this is an understanding of the inevitability of overreaction and not so much condemning it, because I think there is a real logical element in being safe rather than sorry when you face a major crisis. But at the same time, recognizing that you're going to be overreacting and try to figure out how to adjust the balance in a perhaps better way. So those were the thoughts that I had heading into DC that day. So before heading over to the White House, we convened in what became our offices in Washington. This was a SCIF, a secure facility. You could only get in if you had top secret clearance. We had a staff of 9 full-time people who came from various parts of the government and the intelligence community. And the 5 of us were an interesting collection of people. So in addition to myself, there was Mike Morrell. Morrell was a career CIA officer. He served twice as deputy director of the CIA, including at the time of 9/11, and as acting director of the CIA on 2 occasions. He was deeply steeped in foreign intelligence and had only left the CIA several months before, and was not particularly happy to be pulled back in to this world all over again. But he brought a sense of sophistication and depth of knowledge and understanding about this world that I was about to enter, about which I knew no more than any of you knows at that moment. The third person was Peter Swire, a professor at Georgia Tech. Swire had served in both the Clinton and the Obama administrations, and under Obama was the director of privacy and information technology for the executive branch. He had left the government a couple of months earlier and was now back at Georgia Tech. Cass Sunstein, a law professor, former colleague of mine at Chicago, now teaching at Harvard Law School, who is an eminent constitutional scholar and who had just served as director of the Office of Management and Budget in the executive branch, and had left to go back full-time to teaching shortly before that. And the fifth person was Richard Clark, who had served 4 administrations in the State Department and the Department of Defense, an expert in cybersecurity, and also a novelist of some interesting repute. So the 5 of us sit down together, meeting for the first time, except I knew Sunstein, and we introduce ourselves to each other, and the question is, well, now what, right? And we look at each other around this room, and the first thing that was apparent is there's no way we are going to agree on anything, right? That these people are all over the lot in terms of their different perspectives. And so one question that we addressed briefly was, okay, we're going to have to write this report, and when we write this report, what are we going to do when we disagree? This is the first question we talked about. What are we going to do when we disagree? And we decided that, well, we weren't going to decide that now. But it was so apparent to us when we looked at each other that this is not going to be easy, and it's not going to work. So then we went off to the White House, and the president charged us in a 2-hour or so meeting, in which he basically said that he brought together this group and wanted an independent, objective, no-holds-barred evaluation of our foreign intelligence surveillance programs. He was not interested in our legal evaluations of the legality or constitutionality of the programs, because 3 of us weren't lawyers. But he wanted a judgment about, assuming the programs are legal, should we do them as a policy matter? And made very clear that he wanted this to be completely independent and objective, and that was really critical. So then we went back to our SCIF, and we started talking about what do we do. And I should say one thing that I discovered very quickly is that I was in way over my head relative to everybody else in terms of familiarity with and understanding of the internal operations of the intelligence community, about which I knew nothing. And everybody was throwing around acronyms, DARPA and NIST and OPI, and I had no idea what they were talking about. It was like they were talking another language. And so it was extremely daunting trying to even imagine that I would be able to contribute much of value into this process. So, over the course of the next 4.5 months, we spent, on average, 4 days a week in DC, in our skiff. And during that time, we spent many hours meeting with all of the various intelligence agencies and their heads, the Director of National Intelligence, the NSA, the CIA, the FBI, Homeland Security, and a dozen others you never heard of, nor had I ever heard of before. Meeting with the House and Senate Intelligence Committees on multiple occasions, with the House and Senate Judiciary Committees on multiple occasions, with members of the executive branch and the Department of Justice, with the various inspectors general that work with all the different agencies, with privacy and civil liberties groups from across the nation, with international organizations, representatives from the European Union, with representatives from phone companies, from Facebook, from Google, from Apple, all of whom have vested interest in the technology and the impact of the technology on these different programs and so on. All the while trying to get an understanding of what were these programs, how do they operate, looking at material that was completely classified, and to try to come to some understanding of what should we be recommending or not recommending. So the most fascinating thing about the dynamics of this enterprise was that when all was said and done, to all of our shock, we were unanimous on all 46 of our recommendations. And I say this because it was a fascinating experience in interpersonal relations. Because here you have these 5 people who were described by Susan Rice, the Director of National Intelligence, as you take 5 really smart, high testosterone guys, throw them in a room together, tell them no one's in charge, and ask them to solve intractable problems. Good luck with that. Right? And that was what it was like. But what was fascinating is in the course of this incredibly intense time we spent together in this cave, which is what it felt like, we came to have so much respect for each other's comparative expertise and knowledge that we were able to put aside our preconceptions and actually come to common ground on all these often quite controversial programs and recommendations. So that was remarkable. That was really quite an extraordinary piece of this whole thing. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about 2 large observations I had about the experience, and then I'll talk about some of the programs in particular. The 2 large observations had to do with my preconceptions. So one preconception I had, largely formed by the media, was that the problem revealed by Edward Snowden was that the NSA had run amok, that it had initiated on its own a wide range of surveillance programs that were never approved or authorized, and that the part of the challenge was to figure out how to rein in the NSA and to get it to stop doing these things that were not approved or authorized by the government. And that was kind of the way the media characterized a lot of this at the time. So one thing that shocked me is that that was completely and totally false. To my surprise, I came to the judgment, after these many months of working in this world, that the NSA, in fact, was an organization with a high degree of professionalism and integrity that was extraordinarily careful about exercising only authorities that had been, in fact, authorized and approved, and was pretty careful about monitoring its own performance of those authorities to try to ensure that they acted in compliance with what was authorized. And when they found themselves to have gone beyond what was authorized because of misunderstandings of the programs and so on, self-reported to the oversight bodies to disclose they had made mistakes. To the extent the programs that came to light were problematic, which I'll come back to, one thing I determined, it was not the fault of the NSA. Every program that you read about or heard about was approved in advance by the House and Senate Intelligence Committees, by the executive branch of the Department of Justice, and by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, which I'll come back to also. The NSA acted within the scope of what it was authorized to do. So to the extent there are problems with the programs, the problems were not with the NSA running amok, as I had thought. It was with failures on the part of the Congress, the legislative and executive branches in providing authorization to do things that perhaps shouldn't have been authorized. That was an important point, and that's why I like mentioning, because I think the NSA has gotten a bad rap in this respect. The other observation that I guess as a general observation I'd offer is that one of the things I assumed we would need to recommend before I knew anything was oversight. Clearly, if the NSA was running amok, we needed somebody to make sure they were acting properly. And we need to put in place mechanisms to ensure that the NSA's programs are operating in accord with the law. And the other thing I discovered then is that there were, everything I could have imagined as an oversight program already existed. That the NSA and the other agencies reported regularly to the House and Senate Intelligence Committees. The inspectors general overseeing each of the agencies was actually very professional and very rigorous. That the Department of Justice had some terrific lawyers who were dedicated to overseeing these programs, and that the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court oversaw the foreign intelligence programs. The problem was twofold in terms of oversight. One was that the Congress is a complete disaster. I've testified many times in my career before House and Senate committees. And these experiences before both the intelligence committees and the judiciary committees were different from any experiences I'd had in the past. And this was evident in the fact that in the meetings with these committees, which were all closed sessions because they were all secret, top secret information, usually what would happen in the past is you would have the majority of the members of the committee present. They would have some questions written down by their staff, but then they would actually follow up the questions based upon answers that somebody gave, and it would be a real discussion. This time around, the only senators and congressmen in the room were basically the ones who were asking the question at that moment or the next in line. And other than that, they weren't there. And when they were there, they would read the questions from the piece of paper, and then they were not well informed enough to actually ask follow-up questions based upon whatever answers or discussions were taking place. And one of my other former students is a senator from Minnesota, Amy Klobuchar, and she's on the Judiciary Committee. And I asked her afterwards, what's going on here? I don't get it. Like, these are really important issues in the newspapers every day during this time. And she said they're all out in the back calling their donors. Right? That basically the members of Congress are so consumed with fundraising that they were not actually paying much attention to these matters, even matters of national security, in a way that one would have expected them to, and they would have been in the past. That was really disconcerting, and it's a real source of concern, I think, about going forward. But the rest of the oversight was actually done, I thought, quite well. Okay, so I'll mention a couple of aspects of our recommendations. They ran the gamut of, they said 46 recommendations. Some were very complicated, but I'll give examples of particularly the program. I'll focus on the particular program that was most interest to Americans, and that was the so-called Section 215 telephone metadata program, which I'll explain. So to understand how this program comes about and what it is, historically, it was the law that when the president was authorizing foreign intelligence activities, that he could do so outside the ordinary bounds of the Constitution. If the president wanted to wiretap the Russian embassy, for example, he could do that without a warrant, without going to a judge, without probable cause. It was in the commander-in-chief power outside the limitations ordinarily imposed by law or by the Constitution. And the Supreme Court had upheld this doctrine. After the Vietnam era, when it came to light that the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, Army intelligence had been engaging in widespread illegal surveillance of American citizens, Congress decided to look seriously at this question. And the Church Committee was appointed, chaired by Senator Frank Church from Idaho, which came up with a lengthy set of recommendations and a wonderful report. And that basically, for the first time, as a statutory matter, put foreign intelligence that takes place inside the United States under the ambit of the law. Basically provided, for example, that if the president wants to engage in a search of a home or a wiretap in order to determine whether there is a spy or a terrorist operating in the United States, he now had to go to a court the same way a criminal investigation police officer would have to go to a court to get a warrant based upon probable cause. Now that created a problem, because the question was, what judge could the government go to in the context of foreign intelligence? Because foreign intelligence is classified. And judges don't have top secret clearances, and their secretaries don't have top secret clearances, and their buildings are not secure. So you couldn't just go to a judge the way a police officer can and get a warrant for a foreign intelligence wiretap order. There had to be some court created that would be able to operate in a top secret environment, that would be able to put these limitations on the executive branch when it engaged in foreign intelligence surveillance inside the United States. And so it created the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. And the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court consists of regular federal judges who sit for several years as